Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine 18 Tarot and Books. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. In this video, I want to share with you the books that I read in July 2026. We are now over halfway into August, so this is later than usual, but better late than never. I have 9 books to talk about. And all of the books that I read this past month were ebooks, so I will put the covers up here so you can see them. I would say that for the most part, the reading that I did in July was oriented towards 2 things. One was July Noir, and for folks who don't know, July Noir is a short readathon in the same vein as Black Halloween, which is throughout the month of October. But July Noir is a chance to read some of those potential Black Halloween books in July, just over the course of a weekend. These are readathons by Locked Booktician. And so I read a couple of titles for that. I also focused in July on trying to clear out a little bit of a NetGalley backlog. So all of the fiction that I read in July was either a forthcoming or very new recent release in terms of that NetGalley situation that I had going on. So I read 6 arcs in July. I read 2 titles for July Noir. Those were not arcs. And then I read 1 nonfiction book that I just kind of picked up on a whim because I liked the looks of it. So that was my July. I will timestamp below. I will talk about the 1 nonfiction that I read first, then the 2 fiction that I read for July Noir, and then the 6 advanced reader copies that I read to try to get a little bit caught up for that. So nonfiction, I read 1 book, and that was 3 Roads, Labor, Music, and Ecology by Joe Uline. And this is an ebook that I picked up from PM Press because they had a good sale. And so whenever there's a good sale from PM Press, I will look because they have a lot of really good ebooks, very predominantly nonfiction. But there's some fiction there as well. And, it's nice to buy the ebooks from PM Press because you just get to download the files and, they're yours. And PM Press is a cool publisher, politically speaking. I like supporting them. And 3 Roads is one that I had not heard of before, and I had not actually heard of the author, Joe Uline, but when I was reading about him, I thought that the book would be an interesting read. He is someone who started the Labor Network for Sustainability. So the book is really about his experiences working in organized labor, working with trade unions, and then also very specifically kind of doing work in the domain of bringing together labor justice conversations with environmental justice conversations and trying to kind of break down misperceptions among some sections of organized labor that environmentalism is anti-worker or anti-jobs. And so this was a kind of autobiographical, for the most part, with accounts of different organizing that he's done, including kind of the lead up to the big Seattle demos in 1999. Where the kind of Turtles and Teamster ecology and labor conversation took a particular kind of spotlight, I think, if you're familiar with that history. I really enjoyed this book. I am someone who has been involved with union organizing in the past. I've been a member of a labor union executive for a number of years. I was raised by, one of my parents who is in a field where he was in a labor union for much of his career. My mom was not, but my dad was in a labor union for a long time. And so the area of labor organizing is one that I'm really familiar with, experienced with. And reading this book was actually just kind of like talking to, an older friend or relative about his experiences. And I got to learn some different context because Joe Uline is American and his organizing experience is American, and I'm in Canada. So in terms of kind of the national entities that we have experience with, like those are different, but there was a lot familiar in it too. And I really liked the tone of the book. I liked the author's self-reflexivity around, areas where maybe tactics or strategies didn't go as well as they could have, or where unions needed to have, needed to do more work in terms of being more inclusive of all their members and things like that. I really enjoyed the book, and I would really love to have a chat with him someday. And the book really felt like just having a chat with him, and that's what I really liked about it. So if kind of labor history is of interest, I would definitely suggest picking up this book. For fiction, for July Noir, I decided to focus on an genre that I don't normally read, because July Noir has, and so does Black Halloween, a series of different kind of themed areas on a map. And the way that the readathon works is you kind of read in different areas and like complete an area by reading a certain number of books. And the areas are largely kind of genre organized, not super strictly, but they are. And one of those areas is focused on romance. And I don't really read romance. I cannot tell you the last time that I read a book that was, framed or marketed very predominantly as a romance. Obviously, reading fantasy and science fiction and genres like this, there are at times kind of romantic subplots or romantic partners amongst the cast of characters and so on. But books that are like truly romance books are not something I read very much. And so I decided to focus on that area, Shishi's Kitchen, which is the romance-focused area for July Noir and Black Halloween, which are both readathons that celebrate works by Black authors. And I found 2 books for that to complete the romance area. The first one that I read was Loving Safwa by Liza Wemaker. And this is a vampire romance following a very long-lived vampire character who meets her lover, who is her, there's the romance, in the United States in the 1990s. And it's a queer romance. And I had picked this up from the publisher Neon Hemlock quite some time ago, along with some other novellas, and I just hadn't got to it, and so I thought this would be perfect for July Noir. And I loved it. I loved Loving Safwa. I had so much fun. It is heavy as far as a romance goes, for sure, in terms of the the historical elements in the book. I would definitely think about reading the content warnings on this one for sure. But I really, really enjoyed it, and I would love to read more by this author. The other romance that I read for July Noir was Once Ghosted, Twice Shy by Alyssa Cole. And Alyssa Cole writes in a number of different genres. I've definitely heard her name before. I've never read any of her work before. And this book is a contemporary romance set in New York City. And it's part of a series. And I haven't read the rest of the series, and it's not first in the series. And I think that in some ways that affected the reading experience a little bit. From what I can tell, reading about this series online, the books aren't necessarily linear in terms of the plot coming one after the other, but there is some character overlap. There's definitely kind of building elements that are overlapped throughout the series, specifically having to do with characters related to a royal family in a kind of fictionalized African country. And so I didn't have the background of that so much reading about this. And the two partners who meet in Once Ghosted, Twice Shy had met briefly, I guess, in an earlier book in the series, but this book focused on them. And it was the one book in the series, as far as I could tell, that, and the series is all romance, it was the one that featured queer women, and that's why I chose it. I enjoyed this, even though there were little bits of the world building that I think I probably could have had a better background in. I really appreciated the bisexual representation in this book. I felt was really well done. It felt relatable to me, and so I enjoyed it in that sense. I enjoyed reading these two books for July Noir. I don't imagine that I will end up being a reader of a massive amount of romance, but I really appreciate readathons as a way of nudging, outside of the genre comfort zone a little bit, and reading things I wouldn't have otherwise necessarily picked up. And I feel like the Once Ghosted, Twice Shy in particular is something that I probably never would have picked up if it wasn't for July Noir. And I will say that, Locked Petition does an excellent readathon, and I have found some amazing books through these readathons. There's lots of them. There's like Storygraph challenges for July Noir and for Black Queen, and they are full of book suggestions across a wide range of genres. Particularly, there's a lot of thriller, horror, so do check those readathons out if you haven't already. Now, the 6 arcs that I read, the rest of the fiction for July, I read, and this is in no particular order other than the order that I wrote them down on a little post-it that's taped to the tripod. Not the order I read. I read Transmutation Transgression by Darkly Lem. Thank you to Blackstone Publishing for this advanced copy. Darkly Lem is actually a collective of 5 authors co-writing this series called the Formation Saga. The first book in the series was called Transmutation Transience, and this one is Transmutation Transgression. So it's the second book in the series. I will say that this is a series that I'm really enjoying. This is not a series that you can read out of order. This second book really picks up right where the first book left off, and there's a lot of characters and a lot of points of view, and it is all the more complicated for the fact that it is a multiverse science fiction series in which people can jump from iteration to iteration of the world in the multiverse, and when they do, they shift into a new body. And so, there's ways in which this makes things a little harder to follow in places. You really have to pay attention to who's who and who's where. And there are a lot of different kind of factions across this multiverse. One of which is a very, I would say, like colonially inflected, expansionist kind of entity trying to exert control over more and more worlds across this multiverse and trying to bring them into its orbit, its influence, so to speak. And then other groups that are resisting that in different kinds of ways. There's lots of kind of spying and political maneuvering between these different groups. I'm really, really enjoying the series. I can't say too much about the plot of this particular book because, again, it's second in a continuous narrative, but it's quite exciting. And I really like the exciting pacing of it. I almost wish with this series, though, that I hadn't started reading it and been reading it as they're released, because I feel like it took me a second to remember and reorient to what was going on. because it had been quite a while since I'd read the first one. So do check out the Formation Saga. It's really cool. I initially stumbled upon this because one of the 5 authors in Darkly Lem is Cadwell Turnbull, who I really like, whose solo authored work I really like. Yeah, check out the Formation Saga, but definitely start with the first book. Otherwise, it won't make sense. The next one that I will talk about is The Universe Box by Michael Swanwick. This is from Tachyon Publications. Thank you to them for a copy of the book. This is a selection of short stories by Michael Swanwick, who is a well-known, long-established author of speculative fiction of different types. This is a collection that included some science fiction, it included some fantasy, quite internally diverse as a short story collection. And I just picked this up, kind of impulsively. I had never read Michael Swanwick before. I'm pretty unfamiliar with him as an author, but I know that he's published a lot, and is multi-awarded and recognized science fiction and fantasy author. I enjoyed some of the stories in this collection more than others, I would say, and I think that this for me is something that always happens with a collection. Whether it's a single author like this one was or an anthology, inevitably you're going to like some of the stories more and some of the stories a little less. There were some really good ones in here though, that have stuck in my mind. Some of the stories feel a little bit like that kind of style that could be a Black Mirror episode. And I appreciate that when that's done really well. And I think in some instances it really was. I will say my main issue with this book is that a couple of the stories, not most necessarily, but a couple of the stories had gender as a focus or a theme. And when that was a really strong focus or a theme, I found that I liked the stories less. Like I don't know that it was always very well done. From my feminist perspective. So that, I would suggest reading reviews of the collection. I highly doubt that I'm the only reviewer who would say this, but there are some really excellent stories in here, so I'm glad that I picked it up. I finally got to read The Last Contract of Isako by Fonda Lee, published by Orbit Books. This had been on my list for a while, and I've read Fonda Lee before. I read one book by Fonda Lee, and I was keen to pick up another, and I really liked the looks of The Last Contract of Isako, and I quite liked this novel. This is a standalone science fiction novel. To the best of my knowledge, it is intended to remain a standalone, and it is set in a kind of domed habitat on a hostile planet where the humans who live in this domed habitat are kind of terraforming the planet. And there is a level of conflict between factions of people who either want to focus on the terraforming or focus on like relocating from the planet. And that's kind of a backdrop to this narrative. And it's a kind of one last mission story following Isako, who's a contractor, is kind of bodyguard figure for a elite corporate figure, and Isako is investigating a disappearance of her friend, which is not precisely the last mission she's supposed to be on, but ends up being the mission she's on. And of course, there's a wider conspiracy going on that Isako must uncover, which has massive ramifications for kind of core components to this society and this world. I really enjoyed this. The pacing was fast and exciting. I really liked Isako as an older female protagonist. I feel like we don't see a lot of older female protagonists in kind of more action-oriented science fiction. I will say that marketing-wise, there's some of the marketing for The Last Contract of Isako that really emphasizes this kind of samurais in space angle. And I feel like it was a little bit more like corporate espionage than samurais in space. There are definitely, elements of that, but it was a lot more kind of uncovering the mystery than it was like fighting, I would say, in terms of focus. I mean, that's not a criticism. That's just maybe a criticism of some of the emphasis in the marketing, not the book itself. But I could see how someone might pick up the book thinking it would be something else than what it is. And so that's why I would mention it. I really, really enjoyed this, and I have to read more Fonda Lee. I have not read her main trilogy that I know that she is known for, whose name is escaping me right now. But I would like to. I quite enjoyed this. Next, what would be a monthly update for me without an Adrian Tchaikovsky title? I have been really enjoying Adrian Tchaikovsky's work, as people know. I have been reading some of his older books, but in July I read Preaching to the Choir, which is a brand new release from Adrian Tchaikovsky, published on Solaris. And this is a kind of gothic horror feeling book from him. I've enjoyed both his science fiction and his fantasy. And folks may remember from my mid-year book Freakout that one of his fantasy novels was my best read so far of the year. So I was happy to pick up this book. I liked about this book the creepy atmosphere. It follows a couple, an English man and his partner who is American. And it's mostly from her perspective, his partner's perspective. And they go back to this kind of old manor house or estate to a meeting with his family and his extended family, which the narrator was not invited to, that deals with some, of course, family secrets. And I really liked the way that kind of the countryside and the forest surrounding the house, and the house itself and the kind of shadowy rooms and gargoyles and things, I really liked the feeling and the atmosphere of this book. I don't know that I think the plot was doing anything incredibly innovative. I found it a little bit predictable, to be quite honest, but I really liked the atmosphere. I liked the way that the kind of relationship between the English partner and the American partner kind of drew out some contrasts in interesting ways. I liked a lot about this. Yeah, I'm going to say that it was not one of my favorite Adrian Tchaikovsky, if I'm honest. But Adrian Tchaikovsky is quickly becoming one of my favorite authors. So that is not me saying that I thought this book was bad. I think that, it was well written, of course, really atmospheric. It just didn't grab me in terms of the plot, I would say, as much as some of the others have. But if you're a fan of Adrian Tchaikovsky, definitely, I would say, check it out. If you're a fan of kind of gothic feeling horror, I would also say definitely check it out, because I think that, it's very much worth a read. It's a fairly short read, and I did enjoy that book as well. Next up, I will talk about Muntu by Eugen Bacon. This is published by Bad Hand Books. Thank you, Bad Hand Books, for giving me an arc of this title. This is a novella, and I've read a number of works by Eugen Bacon, including short fiction already. And when I see her name on something, I will pick it up for sure. This is a story that follows a character who's named Ivory, who is an orphan as she's growing up, and she becomes a investigator. And this is set in Australia, and I believe Eugen Bacon lives in Australia. And Ivory is investigating these kind of grisly and gory murders of men. And there are supernatural elements to this, or kind of like otherworldly kinds of elements to this, in terms of the trapped spirit. A trapped spirit is involved in this story. I don't want to say too much without giving, to give things away. I will say that again, and this is a marketing thing, I feel like some of the marketing makes this one sound more like a thriller or like an investigation thriller than what I would say that it is. I don't know that that's what it reads as. It didn't read as that for me. I think it reads as something much more interesting, though, as a kind of, mythical, fantastical kind of a story, with some strong horror elements. I found this book quite emotional, particularly with relation to Ivory's upbringing, and yeah, I really appreciated a lot about this book. Eugen Bacon's writing is very special, I think. Really, really, really good. Not a thriller, in my opinion. In my opinion, you can read other people's reviews to see if I agree with other people, but I quite liked this novella. Finally, I also read A Plagued Sea by Kim Bo-young, and this was published by Hanford Star. Thank you, Hanford Star. This is a short novel. It is horror. I did not realize when I requested this on NetGalley that it is very specifically a riff on a specific Lovecraft story. I did not know that. I have never read Lovecraft. I'm not going to read Lovecraft. I'm not fucking interested, for reasons that I think people probably know, in terms of the kind of person that he was. But I have enjoyed a number of different authors' kind of reinterpretations of, Lovecraftian horror kinds of themes. Definitely something like, N.K. Jemison's, like The City We Became, has elements of that. Some of Victor Laval's work has, elements of that. And so when I realized that that's what this book was, it was not something that put me off in any way. I just didn't know that's what I was going to get. And that is very much what I got. So this follows a character who, is traveling as a tourist to a kind of seaside location and ends up stranded there because there is a earthquake. And following this earthquake, there's an outbreak of unusual medical symptoms, we'll say, in this region that was most affected by the earthquake. And so people are quarantined into this area. And it follows the character, it's over, I think it's a bit over a year after the initial quarantine had occurred. And at this point, the main character is, working as a kind of enforcer of the quarantine. So is certainly not, a popular person amongst the local residents. And of course, from what I've said so far, with it being a horror novella, of course, things are much more complicated than just being, quarantined because of an illness, right? There's other things going on that are disturbing and creepy. And this I also really liked. I had a really good July. I had a really good July for reading overall. This was creepy. I found the pacing a little bit uneven, I'll say. And the one thing that I would say that I didn't love about this is that I feel like there are components of the ending to this that felt very out of nowhere. I feel like the book was doing one thing for much of the book, and then towards the very, very end, it kind of did something very, very different. And obviously that can be amazing because it's, oh wow, this is an unexpected twist. But it also just felt kind of disconnected for me. And I don't know if that is something that is mirrored in the Lovecraft story that this story draws from or not. I'm thinking about this book as a standalone, work. So I haven't gone and kind of tried to figure out any kind of comparisons in that sense, but you know, I thought this was interesting though, and I think creepy. There were a couple of scenes in this that I will say got under my skin as far as horror and kind of body horror type content goes. Definitely a creepy one. I have read this author before, and I will happily read this author again, and would recommend checking out Kim Bo-young's work if you haven't already. So that is my July. Let me know, now that we're past the middle of August, if you read anything fabulous in July. I would love to know. I would also love to know if you've read any of these books that I've talked about, or if any of them are on your list. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye.